Good morning, everyone. This is Myla, and my report is all about the role of a worship leader, Chapter 2. According to the author, there are some key roles in ministry in which all of worship leaders should fill. And the first key role that the author mentioned was uh, a worship leader should be a worshiper. It is said that those who are called to lead worship must be worshipers. It makes no difference if they are on stage or sitting in the congregation. If a person can't worship without being upfront, they have no business being upfront. Worship obviously goes beyond outward expression. A worship leader should live a life of worship, and building is vital. Daily devotion and time spent in worship when no one is watching are important aspects in leading worship. There must be time spent in developing a personal relationship with the one we worship. Without without a doubt, King David serves as a role model for everyone who desires to be a worshiper. More than likely, David's initial worship experiences took place while he was tending his father's sheep when no one was looking. It was it was here that he developed an intimate relationship with God. It is impossible to be a worshiper or an effective worship leader without being a person after God's heart. If God's heart that we want to touch during private and corporate worship, if we don't touch God's heart in our private worship, how can take others to the place of God's heart? I have always felt, or the author said that he always felt that it is easier to take someone to a place where you have already been. And he said that if you don't know or we don't know the way to God's heart, it is um, not easy to take someone else there. The second key role is servant. Jesus put a high value on the role of a servant on Matthew 20:26 and Matthew 23, verse 11. It is said that, "But whoever desires to become a great among you, let him be your servant." And again he said, "But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant." It is very important that the worship leader be a servant to the pastor and other leadership in the church. This is accomplished by knowing and implementing the vision of worship established by the leadership, being flexible to last minute requests, and coordinating special events that the pastor feels is necessary for the spiritual growth of the church. A willingness to submit to spiritual authority is at the heart of every servant. Before a person becomes a leader, they must learn to be a follower. Again, we take a look at the life of King David. His worship leading experience began while serving his father as a boy. David learned to kill the lion and the bear before he took on the giant. He later played music for King Saul during Saul's anguish caused by distressing spirit. Then David served as a military commander in Saul's army. Upon Saul's death, David became a servant to all of Israel as king and led Israel's army into battle. A worship leader should also be a servant to those who labor with him to lead worship. Those labor in leading the congregation into the presence of God are very important. The goal of every worship leader should be to make their job as easy as possible. The worship leader should make it a priority to see that each team member has the tools they need to perform their ministry well. This may include having lyric sheets and music available for musicians and singers, making sure visual aids are available to the people who need them, having the proper sound equipment set up and tuned to individual preferences. All of this means being the first to arrive at practice or church on Sunday and the last one to leave. Third is shepherd. Another important role of a worship leader is the role of a shepherd. The role of a shepherd includes all of the things that the author suggested above, plus one important factor, the personal touch. Asaph describes the heart of a shepherd in King David. On Psalm 78, verses 70 to 71, it is said that he chose his servant David, calling him from the sheep pens. He took David from tending the ewes and lambs and made him the shepherd of Jacob's descendants, God's own people, Israel. He cared for them with a true heart and led them with skillful hand. Here, there are three characteristics mentioned in this passage that King David possessed as a shepherd. First, he cared for the people of Israel. Second, he had a true heart or was not clouded with self ambition. And third, he led them with skillful hands or with wisdom. So let's take a look at each. Let's take a look at each of these characteristics. First is they, David cared for them. It is said that a worship leader must love people. He must be willing to get his hands dirty and get involved in the personal lives of those he leads. The worship leader may be enthusiastic about teaching someone to worship, but he should also be concerned whether or not they have money to buy groceries, pay the power bill, or have a rebellious teens that is causing them to grieve. A good shepherd cares about the total person, and a worship leader shows genuine concern about the welfare of others and is willing to get involved however possible. It builds trust. It is impossible to lead without trust. Second, David had a true heart. In other words, he genuinely cared for the people with no strings attached. A worship leader should be free of selfish ambition or motives. Those with selfish ambitions tend to view people as projects and use them as a means to an end. The heart of a shepherd or worship leader has the best interest in mind of the people he is leading in mind. Third, David led with skillful hands or wisdom. When people are viewed as projects, there is the tendency for a leader to become a pusher. A shepherd a shepherd leads a shepherd leads. He doesn't push. Have you ever tried to push a string? When you push a string, it just wads up. People are the same way. They will respond positively to a leader, but they will respond negatively to a pusher. A shepherd or a worship leader will seek God for wisdom as he leads. He will always seek to do God's will in God's way and treat God's people with gentleness and kindness. In John chapter 10 verse 11, it is said that Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep, laying down his life for those in his trust is a characteristic of every good shepherd. A worship leader may be a great singer or musician, but if he is not willing to lay down his life for the sheep, he doesn't need to be placed in such a vital ministry. The ministry of worship leading is a very visible ministry, as visible as that of a pastor. It is imperative to fill that ministry with someone who has the heart of a pastor, a heart for people. And lastly, mentor. The last role of a worship leader that I want or that the author mentioned was a mentor. For a worship leader to be to be an effective mentor, he must not only be a worshiper but also encourage others to worship. This is accomplished by modeling, teaching, and releasing. Mentoring worship takes place in corporate and small group settings or whenever the occasion presents itself. David was a model mentor. He didn't just teach a Sunday school class about worship. He worshiped in the presence of all Israel. David wrote in Psalm 34 verse 3 says, "O magnify the Lord with me, let us exalt his name together." First, David says, "I am going to magnify the Lord. I am going to be worshipper. Let me show you how it is done." Then he invites others to join with him by saying, "Let's magnify the Lord together. Do it with me." In many of David's psalms, he teaches worship by encouraging Israel to recall the mighty acts of God. He often speaks of God's attributes as reasons making him worthy of praise. David also wrote songs of praise and set them to music. He taught the songs to other leaders who in turn taught them to others. Once he had successfully placed the Ark of the Covenant in Zion, he released singers and musicians to lead worship. If you feel that you are called to be a worship leader, take some time to examine your heart and life. Examine to see if you meet these four important criteria that the author mentioned. Ask yourself the following questions. Am I a worshiper? Do I worship not only in corporate settings, but do I have a personal devotional life of a worship? Am I a servant? Am I willing to submit to spiritual authority or do the menial tasks of ministry? Do I genuinely love people or do I see people as stepping stones to self promotion? We all have areas in our lives and ministry that need work. The key is to recognize our weak areas and submit them to others who will hold us accountable to change. As worship leaders, we should be examples of humility and brokenness, willing to repent and change as God grows us into what He has called us to be. Thank you, everyone. This is the end of my presentation. God bless you.